More now on our top story this Newsday, and News Limited Chief Executive Kim Williams' speech to the South Australian Press Club, saying that he would threaten to take proposed changes to media regulation laws to the High Court if it was necessary. Let's get some perspective on this. I'm joined by media commentator, journalist and author Dr. Margaret Simons, the Director of the Centre for Advanced Journalism at the University of Melbourne. Dr. Simons, thanks very much for your time. Kim Williams' speech to this South Australian Press Club, it was, as he said, his first speech since becoming CEO of News Limited, his first chance to really respond following announcing those large changes for News Limited. And he's come out with fighting words when it comes to the Finkelstein Report, describing the recommendations as preposterous and foolish. What's your take on this?
Well, Kim Williams has, over the last decade, consistently argued a point of view against excess regulation, and he normally does that very cogently and well. In this case, I think he's overstating his case considerably. What the Finkelstein Report recommended was that in cases where an independent body has found that a media organisation has been incorrect, that it should publish an apology or a right of reply, and only if it defies that finding, only then should the matter go to the courts. So some would say that that is light-touch regulation rather than being preposterous. I have to say that personally I don't agree with the Finkelstein recommendation, but I do think Kim Williams overstates the case.
So you don't agree either way?
No, I don't, but I think the industry would be in much better shape to argue against the Finkelstein Report if it had been more serious about its own self-regulation. And one of the consistent themes in evidence to the Finkelstein inquiry was that self-regulation by the industry has been a joke, at least until very recent times. And the fault of that lies at the feet of the industry, really. And the industry would be in much better position to argue against more regulation if that hadn't been the case.
I just want to get your reaction to some of his words today at the Press Club in South Australia. Kim Williams has said that no journalist worth his or her salt would regard the creation of Finkelstein's proposed complaints body with anything but foreboding. He says there's no need for such a complaints body. The idea that Australia's reporters are a stew of bias and incompetence is laughable.
Well, in terms of bias and incompetence, it obviously depends where you look. There are many fine journalists working in Australia, including at News Limited. There are also journalists who make mistakes and have faults. One of the other consistent findings in public opinion surveys on whether or not the media has its trust is that only one media organisation in Australia has more than half of the population's trust, and unfortunately that's not News Limited. So I think that the idea that all journalists fall into line with the view of media proprietors on this is simply a fiction. The views are much more various than that, as one would hope.
Yeah, you're the Director of the Centre for Advanced Journalism. I'm interested in your take on another issue that Kim Williams touched on. He's described himself as a firm rejecter of the idea that quality journalism in Australia is on the decline. What do you think?
Well, again, it's a little bit hard to argue. It depends where you look, and it depends what you mean by quality journalism. Certainly there are fewer journalists working for our big media organisations than there were 10 or 20 years ago. That doesn't necessarily directly translate into a decline in quality. It's also the case, of course, that we have more tools for spreading of news and information than any person in human history ever has had before. So journalism is actually changing very rapidly, and that makes questions about what is quality journalism and whether or not it's in decline, that makes it a moving target. It's really very difficult to be definitive on it.
I'm just finally interested in, he also talked about how News Limited has strongly supported the beefing up of the Australian Press Council, and he said that this strikes the right balance between the public's ability to seek redress and the media's independence and protection of free speech.
Well, I would agree with him that the best solution to the issues that are currently before the government is improved media self-regulation, and the Australian Press Council, which is far from a flawless body, and historically I've been extremely critical of it, but it is the best foundation for that attempt. However, I wish the industry had been more serious about this for all of the last 20 to 30 years, rather than just recently discovering the Press Council as its last best friend.
Well, regardless, I imagine it's going to be interesting watching the CEO of News Limited over these times, would you say?
Well, yes, and obviously any media proprietor or media executive is going to be arguing partly from self-interest. As I say, I think Kim Williams overstates the case, although I don't necessarily disagree with him on the fundamentals.
Dr. Margaret Simons, always good to get your insight, and thank you very much for joining us from the University of Melbourne this afternoon.
Pleasure.